well. The same forces that propelled colonialism forward were going to e- end the subsistence farming way of life for these white settlers as well. So, you know, machinery, of course, is developing as people try to make a profit and compete. One of the imperatives of capitalism, the chief imperative, is the profit motive and the imperative of competition, right? In order to make a profit, you have to outcompete. In order to outcompete, you've got to organize your work differently to make it more efficient, and you have to use machinery and technology to the extent possible. And so the race was on to create farming machinery that could amplify the labor power of people and extract as much of whatever commodity or animal people were producing off of that land. So we had motorized tractors starting in the early 20th century. By the 1940s, they were getting a little bit more sophisticated, and with every change, they made things easier, but they also began to price out some of the farmers. And this pricing out, as the machinery got bigger and became more expensive, it was it, it was it was a force that many of these subsistence farmers could not withstand. I talked to farmers from, you know, who were farming in the actually in the 40s and 50s, and they were saying that there was this get bigger, get out experience. They lost their farm, or they lost a part of their farm because they just could not compete with people owned who could afford to own this big equipment. Now we've reached a point where a lot of farmers that are left, they of course they're farming humongous commodity farms and renting their equipment because they can't, nobody can afford to buy it practically. That rental business in farm equipment started in the 60s and 70s, and of course it's very much the case now. So, you know, every time technology improved, there were fewer farmers. And at the same time, we have escalating globalization. Uh, you know, these commodity crops that they were producing, much of them were for export. And as the global economy increased, economic interdependence increased, which is a loss of independence from this perspective, right? Like it's both good and bad. People thought if we're more interdependent economically, you know, we're trading goods back and forth, we're sort of specializing in what we do best, right? Like we're the breadbasket of the world. We produce a lot of grain, we produce a lot of meat, and so on. This will be good. We'll all be more efficient, and the world will be a more peaceful place because everybody will realize that they can rely on each other. Well, that hasn't really actually happened, uh, at least not, certainly not perfectly. Um, and we cannot at this point supply all of our own food, fuel, or technology. So the downside of globalization, among other things, is, well, it's cultural, you know, but it's also um, you lose some of your independence. International corporations escaped national control and began to affect politics, not just in our country, but around the world, and sometimes dominating smaller countries that are resource rich but were unstable politically. In some countries, those international corporations really are the government. Post World War II, America became a military and economic superpower that attempted to make the world safe for U.S. business interests, and so extended its military power across the globe. Couple of points that I can just kind of make to try to describe how conscious that was, right? Is the Food for Peace program that emerged in the 1940s, um, through, I think it was inspired by this Ezra Taft Benson, Eisenhower Secretary of Agriculture. It might have, no, I think it was actually even before that. But it was this idea that we could take the excess production that we were experiencing because of sort of biggering our farming and all of our technological improvements, and we could turn it into this commodity crop soft power, taking our commodity grain and food and kind of using it as food aid around the world, damaging those countries' incentive and ability to provide that food for themselves. So it was a charitable, sort of sold as a charitable idea that we are making peaceful gestures, we are helping people out, we are, quote, feeding the world. But when you dump a lot of cheap commodities on a country, it has a tendency to shift its economic priorities as well. And so dependency began to be formed around this food for peace or food aid. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, Ezra Benson, encouraged subsistence farmers in the United States to do something else, to get out of business, to make way for this bigger uh, commodity farming system. Um, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, is famous for explicitly saying food is a weapon. It is one of the principal tools in our negotiating kit. In other words, once you get countries used to our trade, our goods, right, out competing their own farmers or supplying technology that makes industrial farming possible in their own country, you have leverage, you have power. So the message to farmers in the United States, as well as increasingly elsewhere in the world, in countries like India, is get big or get out. That isn't something actually either of these two fellows said. It's what farmers heard, though. You need to get big or get out. So this is a chart of what's happened to farmland in the United States. Okay. So you can see there was a peak of farms in around 1930. And of course, we had the Great Depression. So this is part of the reason for the fall off. But even it keeps falling and falling and falling and falling. And you get to 1970, it's kind of at its nadir, it gets a little bit lower here. But you can see this huge drop off here in the actual number of farms, okay? And you see at the same time this increase, quite rapid increase in the number of acres per farm, meaning the farms are getting fewer and bigger, and that started in the 40s and 50s, okay? And you see that land and farms really hasn't increased all that much. As a matter of fact, it's decreased of late, okay? So it's not that we've put more land and farm, we've actually put less land and farms, but we're getting more out of that land and fewer people own it, right? Our farming has intensified due to our technologies. So we can extract a lot of produce and stuff from our land, right? But we don't need as much. So we put a lot of that land into suburbs, okay? Now with this line here, you have people losing their farms and therefore their independent livelihoods. Boom. That's a huge loss. Okay. And it necessitated another mass migration. We have the mass migration happening out of rural areas into urban areas. And this is the red and the blue map. Okay. The red is primarily not urban. It's all those spaces that an awful lot of people have left to concentrate in cities where the jobs are. So the mass migration out of rural areas has fueled our political dynamic. There's definitely a big correlation between red and rural and blue and urban. In the chapter, I talk a little bit about how our entertainment industry tried to sort of cope with or help people cope with and conceptualize new aspirations, a new way of life when people were no longer able to or interested in farming as a way of sort of achieving self-sufficiency and independence. Um, the Leave It to Beaver Cleaver family is often thought of as this kind of nostalgic, feel good, wholesome, all American family that people look back on and somehow think, gosh, like, oh, I wish we were still like that. Men were men and women were women, and the whole family ran, quite that neat and tidy. However, if you look at those TV shows, and I watched quite a few, all right, and you really think about it, this is a weird family, okay? What I found out was that Ward Cleaver, the father in this family, in the show, not in real life, in the show, he is the son of a farmer. He left the farm behind and he aspired to he got a degree in philosophy and then he went into marketing. So he's a college graduate. They aspired to have their kids be college graduates too. The way to make good money was to be a college graduate and to go into something that would help boost the economy. And it was in the 40s and 50s that the marketing industry took off because you needed to sell these all these new commodities and these new products that we were able to make, many of which people didn't need, right? In order for more people to make money and yeah, they get jobs. And June is this ultimate consumer. Her job is to look beautiful and to do, like do some housework, but it's light, seems kind of not a bad deal, okay? She just sort of purchases things and tries to make sure that her kids are clean and that they want to go to college. And the kids no longer really help out with the family. They mainly get into trouble and hijinks and have a good time. And that is just not the way people have lived for most of human existence. It's weird, okay? So and there's a lot of therapeutic like suggestion, about how to like cope with this new family situation, right? And how to think about it. And this idea of like creative parenting, where you sort of see the kid as the project, and every experience they have is more or less something that can mold and shape them into a better person. So a lot of attention is focused on the children, and the children don't necessarily feel useful. They feel like the projects that they are. So I would just say, like, this is my first foray into writing about like a cultural phenomenon like Leave It to Beaver, but I enjoyed doing it, and I actually think that this is a pretty weird and revolutionary family that they're trying to sell to us. It's nuclear. They don't have like an extended family that can back them up. Um, 3 out of the four of these people don't work at all, and the fourth one works doing you know, some some stuff that's not necessary and he sits behind a desk. Okay. There's lots of money to be made in camels, as it turns out, right? So this whole industry develops of, selling things that aren't even good for us. And the classic example of that is, Madison Avenue's approach to cigarettes. And, that's a Don Draper from Mad Men, but, that show exemplifies how hard these people work at trying to sell cigarettes. Just as an example, you know, um, finding doctors to tell people that they're not only cool but healthy, very healthy. They calm your nerves. He knew what he was doing. But you need to sell things, right? People need to make money. If they don't make money, see, the loss here from subsistence farming to Madison Avenue is you now absolutely need money to survive. You don't have the ability to provide those things for yourself. Okay, so, and as these new tractors and cars develop, these new modes of communication, of transport, um, fuel needs changed. The coal miners are another example of uh, these imperatives changing and then putting these people out of their livelihood, causing mass migrations. J.D. Vance's family was impacted by this, right? His book Hillbilly Elegy is about the aftermath of living in Appalachia and then the mass migration out of Appalachia. The mass migration took place between 1910 and 1960 as coal mining as chief livelihood continued to decrease. Millions of people left states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas, and West Virginia for economic reasons, landing in cities to do things like auto manufacturing. So they ended up in cities like Detroit and Chicago, Cleveland and Cincinnati, following the money. The money wasn't to be had where they were. They weren't making as much money. So they moved. And now things seem okay for a while. Okay. But everything changes because the imperative is to make money and this isn't a fault of business owners or even corporations. It is an absolute imperative. It is make money or go out of business. And to do that, they have to compete. So they're always looking for ways to cut down on their labor costs, right? And so they fought with the unions as the unions developed to try to reduce union power. And one of the ways that they reduced union power for sure is through automation and through sending manufacturing overseas. So so much of a car is now made with robots, right? And auto manufacturing declined as far as jobs goes. Um, and I think this is from Detroit, but in a lot of these cities, they're just littered with these abandoned factories and warehouses from previously booming areas of these cities. That's also caused a mass migration. Okay, now this migration is maybe a little bit more mental than it is physical because where are these people going to go, right? Now they're in jobs that don't pay as well, don't feel as secure as the high days of the factory job when multiple generations could kind of be guaranteed like they were for a while in areas like coal mining, right? Of at least being able to make a living. Now our working class, a lot of them are in service and technology jobs, and there's no promise of long-term job stability in those jobs, and there's often low pay. And technology jobs, which a lot of people laud as kind of like the solution, like that's the latest thing that everybody wants their kids to go into. But technology is, in some ways, the worst place for dislocation and disembedding and disruption because it is constantly changing and automating. So we live with an incredible history of dislocation and trauma and constant jolts of change that have left people unable to like fall back on. What do they fall back on most of the time? Most times we don't have our extended family. We don't really even have a concept of that in a lot of cases. And even our nuclear family may be split up, seeking work, or just unable to get along, right? Dealing with the pressures of life. We I think we deeply feel insecure for good reasons. We are deeply insecure. This is our situation. And I don't think human beings were made and geared to deal with this level of change. As cool